Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The steel groaned like a dying beast, and I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots. Not the steady hum of the reactor, but the rhythmic, wet thud of a fist hitting the pressure hatch. "Let me in, Elias," a voice rasped, or what used to be a voice. It sounded like wet gravel being ground through a meat processor. It was Chief Miller, or it was his shell. I could see him through the reinforced circular glass, his face a map of ruptured capillaries and peeling gray skin. His eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were milky spheres of cataracts and milky white rage. He slammed his forehead against the glass, leaving a smear of black, viscous fluid that looked like oil. I backed away, my hands shaking so hard I dropped my wrench. It clattered against the metal floor, the sound echoing down the narrow, red-lit corridor of the USS Vengeance. We were 800 feet below the Atlantic, trapped in a pressurized cylinder of steel, and the world above was dead. But the dead weren't staying still. The air was thick with the smell of recycled oxygen, copper, and something far worse, the sweet, cloying stench of rot that had begun to seep through the ventilation shafts. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid lead. Just 2 hours ago, we were a silent hunter, a nuclear-armed shadow patrolling the depths. Then the flash message came through. Not a drill, not a test. A total societal collapse on the surface. We thought we were safe down here. We thought the ocean would be our shield. We were wrong. The virus didn't come from the air, it came from the shore leave in Norfolk. Patient zero was Seaman Vance. He'd complained of a fever during the first watch. By the second watch, he was chewing through the jugular of the man in the bunk above him. Now, the Vengeance was a floating tomb. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating bulkhead, listening to the cacophony of screams echoing from the mess deck. High-pitched, desperate shrieks that were abruptly cut short by a wet, tearing sound. I could hear them shuffling in the shadows, the wet slap of bare feet on metal, the heavy, labored breathing of things that no longer needed to breathe to live. My vision blurred as cold sweat stung my eyes. I was alone in the torpedo room, the massive Mk-48s looking like indifferent metal gods in the gloom. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. I gripped the heavy pipe I'd scavenged, my knuckles white. The silence was the worst part. Between the bursts of violence, the submarine was deathly quiet, save for the creak of the hull under the immense pressure of the abyss. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every hiss of a steam valve sounded like a snarl. I moved toward the ladder, my movements slow and deliberate, terrified that the slightest noise would draw them to me. My boots felt like they weighed 100 pounds. I reached the ladder and began to climb, my palms slick with grease and sweat. Halfway up, I stopped. Above me, the hatch to the upper deck was slightly ajar. A single blood-stained finger was hooked over the edge. It didn't move. It was just there, a pale, bloated digit with a jagged, broken nail. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my eyes fixed on that finger. Then it twitched. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the metal of the ladder. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was a desert of fear. I slowly retreated, step by agonizing step, back down to the deck. I had to find a way to the engine room. If I could lock myself in the reactor compartment, maybe I'd have a chance. The lead shielding would keep them out, and the air filtration was independent. But to get there, I had to cross the galley. And the galley was where the screams were loudest. I crept down the narrow passageway, the walls closing in on me. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach out, whispering my name in the voice of my dead mother. It was the lack of sleep, the nitrogen narcosis of fear. I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. It was tall and lopsided. It walked with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping into place with audible cracks. It was the ship's cook, Petty Officer Henderson. His apron was soaked a deep, dark crimson. He was carrying a meat cleaver, but he wasn't holding it like a tool. He was holding it like an extension of his own broken psyche. He turned his head toward me, a full 180 degrees, his neck making a sound like dry sticks breaking. He didn't have a jaw. It had been torn away, leaving a jagged cavern of raw muscle and hanging tendons. He let out a wet, bubbling sound and lunged. I swung the pipe with everything I had. The impact felt like hitting a sack of wet sand. The pipe buried itself in his temple, and for a second we were locked in a grotesque embrace. The smell was unbearable, the scent of a wee-cold carcass left in the sun. He didn't fall. He just leaned into me, his dead weight pushing me against the wall. I shoved him off, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud, but he was already trying to push himself back up. They didn't die. Not unless you destroyed the brain completely. I scrambled past him, my boots slipping on the gore-slicked floor. I burst into the galley, and the sight stopped me cold. It was a slaughterhouse. Bodies, or parts of them, were strewn across the stainless steel tables. The smell of copper was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. And they were there, 4 of them, hunched over a pile of what used to be the Navigator. They didn't look up at first. They were too busy, their heads bobbing in a sickening rhythm. The sound of their feeding, the wet tearing, the crunch of bone, was the only sound in the room. Then, one by one, they stopped. They lifted their heads, their faces masked in red. Their eyes locked onto mine with a singular predatory focus. There was no humanity left in those gazes, only a bottomless, aching hunger. I turned and bolted. My feet pounded against the deck plates, the sound like thunder in the enclosed space. I could hear them behind me, the frantic, scrambling footsteps of something that didn't care about pain or exhaustion. I reached the bulkhead door to the engine room and slammed my shoulder into it. It was locked. I fumbled with the manual override, my fingers feeling like sausages. Come on, I hissed, the words a frantic prayer. The first one reached me. It was a young recruit, barely 20. He tackled me, his teeth snapping inches from my throat. I jammed my forearm under his chin, smelling the rot on his breath. He was incredibly strong, a mindless, muscular force. I reached for the override lever one last time and yanked it down. The door hissed open, and we both tumbled into the darkness of the transition lock. I kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling back into the galley, and slammed the heavy steel door shut. The thud of his body hitting the other side vibrated through my entire body. I leaned against the door, sliding down to the floor, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I was safe. For now. But the vengeance was deep and the hunger was everywhere. I looked at my arm. A thin, red scratch ran from my wrist to my elbow. It wasn't deep, but the edges were already turning a bruised, sickly purple. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The ocean wasn't my shield, and the submarine wasn't my sanctuary. It was my cage, and the clock was ticking. I looked around the dim, humming space of the engine room. The massive turbines felt like tombstones. I wasn't just surviving a submarine. I was waiting to become the very thing I feared. I gripped my pipe, the cold steel the only thing tethering me to reality. Above me, millions of tons of water pressed down, a weight that matched the crushing despair in my chest. I had to find a way out. I had to find the escape trunk. But to do that, I'd have to go back out there, back into the dark, back into the teeth of the abyss. The scratching on the door started again, soft at first like a mouse, then growing into a frantic, desperate clawing. They knew I was here. They could smell the life left in me, and they were patient. Deep beneath the waves, time didn't matter. Only the hunger did. I stood up, my legs feeling like water. I couldn't stay here and wait to turn. If I was going to die, it wouldn't be as a monster. I looked at the manual release for the outer hatch. It would crush the ship, killing everyone and everything instantly. A mercy, or a coward's way out. The scratching grew louder, joined by the sound of more bodies pressing against the steel. The door began to groan under the pressure. I looked at the scratch on my arm again. The purple veins were spreading, reaching toward my heart like a spider web. I had minutes, maybe an hour. I grabbed a flashlight from the wall rack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the long, narrow path toward the stern. I wouldn't let the darkness take me, not without a fight. I started walking, the light dancing on the pipes and wires, a lone spark of life in a metal grave. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a death knell. But I kept moving, because in the deep, the only thing worse than dying is being forgotten in the dark. The flashlight's beam was a dying thing, a yellowed, sickly eye that flickered every time my heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel the heat now, a slow-rolling fever that started at the scratch on my forearm and radiated outward, turning my blood into liquid lead. The purple veins weren't just spreading, they were pulsing, a rhythmic throb that matched the distant, heavy thud of the ocean pressing against the hull. I moved through the narrow passageway of the upper level, my boots stepping softly on the non-skid flooring, though the sound felt like thunder in the oppressive silence of the dead ship. To my left, the piping for the high-pressure air systems hissed, a tiny, microscopic leak that sounded like a mocking whisper. I kept my hand on the cold steel of the bulkhead, using it to steady myself as the world tilted. It wasn't the ship's motion. The ballast tanks were set, we were level. It was me. The infection was starting to nibble at my equilibrium, fraying the edges of my vision until the shadows seemed to stretch and reach out like oily fingers. I reached the hatch leading down into the engineering lower level. I paused, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Down there the air would be thicker with the smell of grease, ozone, and the copper-sweet tang of blood that had been aging in the recycled air for days. I gripped the handwheel, my knuckles white and shaking. As I turned it, the metal groaned, a shrill, screeching protest that echoed through the ventilation ducts. I froze, holding my breath, listening for the response. It came almost instantly. A frantic, wet slapping of bare feet on metal grating somewhere below, followed by a low, guttural croak that didn't sound human. It was the sound of vocal cords shredded by screaming, now used only for hunger. I didn't have a gun. The small arms locker had been cleared out during the initial panic, and all I had was a heavy emergency wrench tucked into my belt and a folding knife that felt pathetic against what was waiting for me. I forced the hatch open and slipped through, descending the ladder with a clumsy desperation, my boots ringing out against the rungs. The lower level was a nightmare of tangled machinery and deep, impenetrable shadows. The emergency lighting was out here, leaving me entirely dependent on the fading flashlight. I panned the beam across the space. The auxiliary generators sat like silent, hulking beasts, draped in shadows. Then the light caught a splash of color that didn't belong, a bright neon-orange flight suit. It was Miller, or what was left of him. He was slumped against a junction box, his head tilted back at an impossible angle. His jaw was gone, ripped away to reveal the jagged, bloody mess of his throat, yet his eyes were wide and milky, staring at the overhead. As my light hit him, his fingers began to twitch. He wasn't dead. None of them were. He let out a wet, bubbling sound, his body jerking as he tried to push himself off the deck. I didn't wait to see if he could manage it. I lunged past him, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My lungs felt like they were filling with sand. Every inhalation was a struggle, the air tasting of rust and decay. I pushed deeper into the stern, toward the maneuvering room. I needed to find a way to vent the atmosphere, or at least seal off the reactor compartment before the infection turned my brain to mush. The psychological weight of the submarine was becoming as heavy as the water outside. We were trapped in a steel pipe, miles beneath the surface, surrounded by the crushing blackness of the abyss, And yet the real threat was the person standing next to you, the person you'd shared coffee with, the person who knew your kids' names. I saw a locker ahead, the red cross barely visible through the grime. I stumbled toward it, my legs feeling heavy and unresponsive. I tore the door open, the contents spilling onto the deck. Bandages, antiseptic, a few vials of morphine. Nothing that could stop what was happening to me. But there was a bottle of high-strength stimulants meant for the crew during prolonged combat scenarios. I grabbed it, unscrewing the cap with my teeth and swallowing 2 of the pills. I needed the focus. I needed to burn through the fog the virus was weaving in my mind. The effect was almost instantaneous. My heart rate skyrocketed and the edges of my vision sharpened, though the purple veins on my arm seemed to glow with a malevolent intensity. I felt a surge of artificial energy, a jagged, nervous heat that pushed back the exhaustion. I kept moving. The sound of the scratching was getting closer, coming from the ventilation shafts above me. They were navigating the ship's guts, moving through the spaces too small for a healthy man to crawl. I reached the bulkhead door to the reactor auxiliary room and found it blocked. Something heavy had been pushed against the other side. I threw my weight against it, the metal thudding dully. "Is anyone there?" I wheezed, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. No answer, just a slow, rhythmic scratching from the other side of the steel, like fingernails on a chalkboard. I realized then that the door wasn't blocked to keep things out. It was blocked to keep something in. I backed away, the flashlight beam dancing erratically. I could hear them now, the collective breathing of a dozen or more infected behind that door, a wet synchronized huffing. They knew I was there. They could smell the sweat, the fear, and the ripening scent of the infection already blooming in my marrow. I turned to find another route, but the beam of my light caught a pair of eyes reflecting from the darkness near the bilge pumps. It was small, crouching. A mess cook named Leo. He had been a kid, barely 20. Now his skin was the color of wet parchment, and his mouth was frozen in a permanent, toothy snarl. He didn't scream. He just launched himself at me, a blur of gray skin and tattered fabric. I swung the wrench with a blind, panicked force. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch as the heavy tool connected with his temple. He went down, but he didn't stay down. He scrambled at my legs, his fingers digging into my calves with unnatural strength. I kicked him back, the heavy heel of my boot crushing his ribs, but he just kept coming, driven by a neurological fire that defied pain. I managed to scramble up a maintenance ladder, my hands slick with grease and Leo's blood. I climbed until I reached a narrow catwalk overlooking the main engine room. Below me, the massive turbines lay dormant, silent giants that should have been humming with power. The air down there was shimmering with heat. The cooling systems were failing. If the reactor went into a melt state, this sub wouldn't just be a grave. It would be a dirty bomb at the bottom of the Atlantic. I looked down at my arm. The purple lines had reached my elbow. The skin was starting to slough off in small, dry flakes, revealing a dark, bruised tissue underneath. I felt a strange sense of detachment, a cold, clinical curiosity about my own decomposition. Was this how it felt for the others? Did they watch themselves rot from the inside out, powerless to stop the hunger from overriding their souls? The catwalk groaned under my weight. I moved toward the aft escape trunk, my only hope for a localized purge. If I could get to the controls, I could blow the external hatches in this section without compromising the entire hull's integrity. It would suck everything in the engineering deck out into the crushing pressure of the deep, including me. A burial at sea. It was better than what Miller was doing, staring at the ceiling while his body refused to die. But as I reached the end of the catwalk, I saw the problem. The control panel for the escape trunk had been smashed, not by the infected, but by someone who didn't want anyone leaving, or someone who didn't want anything getting out. I slumped against the railing, the stimulant-induced clarity beginning to fracture into paranoia. The shadows were moving again, but this time they weren't the infected. They were shapes, memories, faces of the crew I had failed. I saw the captain, his face half-eaten, standing at the end of the catwalk. He wasn't moving, just watching me with those dead, milky eyes. "It's a tomb, son," the hallucination whispered. Or maybe it was just the wind in the pipes. "We're all just fuel for the fire now." I closed my eyes tight, shaking my head until the metal screamed in my ears. When I opened them, the captain was gone, replaced by the reality of a lone infected climbing the railing 20 feet away. It moved with a jerky, spider-like grace, its limbs twisting in ways they shouldn't. I reached for the wrench, but my hand wouldn't close. The infection had reached the nerves in my fingers. They were stiff, claw-like, the skin turning a bruised, necrotic black. I looked at the wrench on the floor, then at the infected creature closing the distance. A strange calm washed over me. The fear was being replaced by a dull, heavy apathy. This was the end of the line. The submarine, this pinnacle of human engineering, this apex predator of the ocean, was nothing more than a rusted can full of spoiled meat. And I was the last piece of fruit on the vine, waiting to drop. But then a sound, not a scratch, not a groan, a ping, the sonar. Somewhere in the forward part of the ship, the sonar was active. It was the rhythmic, mathematical pulse of something searching. Someone was still alive in the sonar shack, or more terrifyingly, something had learned how to turn it on. The pulse echoed through the hull, a deep asterisk vrip, vrip, that vibrated in my very bones. It was a call, a signal. I felt a spark of something, not hope, but a primal, stubborn refusal to die in this specific corner of the dark. I forced my stiff fingers to wrap around the wrench, using my other hand to lock them into place. I stood up, my legs shaking, the fever burning a hole in my consciousness. I wouldn't go to the escape trunk. I would go forward. I would find the source of that ping. If there was someone left, I would help them. And if there wasn't, if it was just a machine crying out in the wilderness of the ocean, then I would find the reactor scuttle switch. I wouldn't let this ship drift forever, a ghost haunted by the hungry dead. I started back across the catwalk, my movements slow and deliberate. The infected creature in front of me hissed, its jaw unhinging, but I didn't flinch. I swung the wrench with everything I had left, the weight of the steel doing the work my muscles no longer could. The creature fell, tumbling over the railing into the darkness of the engine room below. I didn't watch it hit the deck. I just kept walking. Every step was a battle against the gravity of my own death. The hallway seemed to stretch, the walls closing in until the pipes were brushing against my shoulders. I passed the galley, the smell of rotting food mingling with the metallic scent of the infection. I saw a shadow move in the walk-in freezer, the door hanging off its hinges, but I didn't look. I couldn't afford to see any more ghosts. I reached the bulkhead leading to the midship section, the transition point between the engine room and the living quarters. The door was sealed, but the electronic lock was still humming. I punched in the code, my numb fingers fumbling over the keypad. The light turned green, and the hydraulic seals hissed, releasing a cloud of cold, stale air. The sight on the other side stopped me in my tracks. The corridor was filled with water about a foot deep, and it was thick with a dark, viscous fluid. Bodies floated face down, their hair waving like seaweed in the slow current created by the ship's ventilation. The sonar ping was louder here, a deafening asterisk clack that seemed to shake the very water. I stepped in, the coldness of the flood shocking my system, momentarily clearing the fever dream from my head. I waded through the graveyard, my flashlight beam reflecting off the bloated, pale skin of my former shipmates. I felt a hand brush against my ankle, and I nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was just a loose glove, drifting in the current. I reached the ladder leading up to the bridge and sonar shack. The pings were constant now, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I climbed, my breath coming in jagged stabs, my heart feeling like it was trying to burst through my ribs. I pushed open the hatch to the sonar room and collapsed onto the deck. The room was bathed in the soft blue light of the consoles. And there, sitting in the operator's chair, was a figure. They were slumped over the controls, their hand resting on the manual pulse trigger. I crawled toward them, my voice a dry rattle. Hey, I'm here. The figure turned. It wasn't a man. It was a woman, the sonar tech, Sarah. Her face was untouched, her eyes clear, but her chest was still. She had been dead for hours, maybe days, but her hand was caught in the mechanism of the chair as the ship tilted slightly, causing her lifeless weight to press the trigger in a rhythmic, accidental loop. The signal wasn't a call for help. It was a mechanical coincidence. A dead girl's hand knocking on the door of the world. I sat there in the blue light, the infection finally reaching my chest. I could feel my heart slowing, the purple veins wrapping around my ribs like a cage. I looked at Sarah, then at the screen. The sonar was showing something. A contact. A massive solid shape sitting just a few hundred yards away on the ocean floor. It wasn't another sub. It was a trench, a hole in the world. I realized then where we were. We were at the edge of the abyss, the place where the light never reaches. I reached out with my blackened, ruined hand and covered Sarah's. I pressed the trigger one last time, a long, sustained pulse that screamed out into the water, a final "we were here" to the empty sea. Then, I reached for the reactor override switch on the wall behind us. My fingers found the glass cover. I didn't have the strength to break it, so I leaned my head against it, using the weight of my dying body to shatter the thin pane. The alarm began to blare, a beautiful, high-pitched wail that drowned out the scratching, the groaning, and the silence. I pulled the lever. The ship didn't explode, not at first. There was just a deep, low hum that started in the floor and rose up through the soles of my boots. The lights flickered, turned a brilliant, blinding white, and then went out. In the final darkness, the fever left me. The hunger vanished. There was only the cold, the pressure, and the sudden, overwhelming peace of the deep. I closed my eyes, the smell of ozone the last thing I knew as the ocean finally came to claim its own. No more monsters, no more shadows. Just the long, quiet sleep in the heart of the machine. The submarine groaned one last time, a final breath of escaping air, and then there was nothing but the heavy, silent weight of the Atlantic, holding us all in its cold, uncaring embrace. I was no longer a survivor. I was part of the wreck, a ghost in the gears, finally free of the dark. But the darkness didn't keep me. The peace was a lie, a momentary lapse in the physics of pain, a hallucination born of oxygen deprivation and the sheer, crushing weight of despair. My eyes snapped open, and instead of the afterlife, I found a nightmare of neon blue and suffocating brine. The reactor hadn't detonated in a mushroom cloud of cleansing fire. It had buckled, a containment breach venting ionized radiation directly into the flooded compartments. The water around me wasn't just cold anymore. It hummed with a sickly, electric heat. I was gasping, my lungs screaming for air that was mostly smoke and aerosolized coolant. I wasn't dead. I was buried alive in a billion-dollar tomb at the bottom of the Atlantic, and the monsters were still waking up. I felt the pressure first, a physical hand squeezing my skull, then the sound. A long, agonizing shriek of metal as the USS Sentinels settled into a trench it was never meant to inhabit. I scrambled upward, my fingers clawing at the slick, oily surface of the overhead pipes. The emergency lighting flickered back to life, not in the steady red of combat, but in a spasmodic, dying strobe that transformed the flooded corridor into a series of terrifying snapshots. In the first flash, I saw the water. It was waist-deep and churning with debris. In the second flash, I saw the bodies. They weren't floating. They were standing. The things that had been my crew, my friends, were anchored to the floor by some horrific instinct, their pale, waterlogged flesh turning a translucent, bruised purple under the radiation's glow. The fever that had left me was replaced by a different kind of sickness, a thrumming vibration in my marrow. I coughed, spitting out a mixture of blood and seawater, and lunged for a dangling cable to pull myself onto a high-pressure steam line. Below me, the water hissed. The radiation wasn't killing the infected, it was feeding them. I watched, paralyzed, as a petty officer whose name I'd forgotten, a man who had taken a bite to the throat 3 hours ago, jerked his head toward me. His eyes weren't white anymore. They were luminescent, a pale, radioactive green that mirrored the dying reactor's heart. He didn't groan. He let out a wet, clicking sound like a Geiger counter hitting a hot zone. Then he lunged. I kicked him back into the rising tide, the impact of my boot against his decaying chest sounding like a shovel hitting wet clay. I had to move. The sub was tilting at a 30-degree angle, the bow buried in the silt of the seafloor, the stern, where the escape trunks were, rising up toward the unreachable surface. I began to climb, hand over hand, along the cable runs of the auxiliary machinery space. Every muscle in my body felt like it was being shredded by hot glass. The air was getting thinner, the smell of ozone and rotting meat thick enough to chew. "Is anyone there?" A voice crackled over the ship's internal comms, a jagged burst of sound that nearly made me lose my grip. It was Kavik, Lieutenant Sarah Kavik. I thought she'd been gutted in the torpedo room. "Echo 1, if you're alive, get to the lockout chamber. I've got the bypass. I've got the cure." The word cure hit me harder than the pressure. It was a lure, a hope so sharp it felt like a knife. I didn't stop to wonder how she'd survived or where this cure had come from. I just climbed. I reached the hatch to the mid-level deck and hauled myself through, the sound of splashing water following me like the footsteps of a giant. The corridor here was a charnel house. The radiation hadn't reached this high yet, but the carnage was absolute. Limbs were wedged into the door frames. The walls were painted in a vertical spray of arterial spray that had dried into a crusty, black lacquer. I ran, my boots skidding on the slime of internal organs, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing hitches. I could hear them behind me, the clicking. The glowers were coming up the ladders. They were faster now, their muscles fueled by the very energy that should have been melting their DNA. I reached the command center, the heart of the ghost ship. The doors were sealed, but the manual override wheel was slick with something cold. I put my shoulder into it, screaming as the metal groaned, and slipped inside. Kavik was there. She was standing by the tactical console, her face illuminated by the flickering green of the sonar screen. She looked perfect. Too perfect. Not a scratch on her, not a drop of blood on her pristine coveralls. In her hand, she held a reinforced cryo case. "You made it," she said, and her voice didn't have the tremor of a survivor. It had the cold, calculated resonance of a predator. "I didn't think a grunt like you would have the constitution to survive the vent." "The cure," I gasped, reaching out, my hand trembling, my skin already beginning to blister from the exposure. "Give it to me. We have to get to the pod." Kavik smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd seen since the world ended. She didn't move toward me. She moved toward the primary airlock, her hand hovering over the seal. "There is no cure for the world, Miller, only for the chosen. This isn't a vaccine, it's the sequence. The data on how the virus interacts with high-yield ionizing radiation. The glowers, that was the goal. Evolutionary acceleration in a controlled, high-pressure environment. You were just the control group." The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the stomach. The sub hadn't been an accidental tomb, it was a laboratory. The outbreak hadn't been a failure of containment, it was an experiment. and I had been the one to trigger the final phase by pulling that lever. I had fed my friends to the reactor to satisfy a research paper. I lunged for her, a roar of primal rage tearing from my throat, but she was faster. She drew her sidearm, a suppressed HK, and fired. The bullet took me in the shoulder, spinning me around and slamming me against the navigation table. The pain was white-hot, but the cold realization was worse. She wasn't going to kill me. Not yet. She needed someone to draw the heat. "The aft escape trunk is prepped for one," she said, backing toward the airlock. "The weight limit is strict, you understand, but don't worry, you've earned your place in history. You're the first of a new species." She punched a code into the keypad. The airlock hissed, the vacuum of the pressurized chamber sucking the remaining air out of the room. Outside the heavy plexiglass of the command center, I saw them, the shadows in the water. They were tapping on the glass, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They weren't trying to break in. They were waiting for their leader. Kavik stepped into the airlock, the cryocase clutched to her chest. "Thank you for your service," she whispered. The inner door slammed shut, locking with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. I was alone. The wound in my shoulder was pulsing, a dark, rhythmic reminder of my mortality. I looked at the monitors. The reactor was reaching critical mass. In less than 10 minutes, the Sentinels wouldn't just be a wreck, it would be a molten crater on the ocean floor. And Kavik was going to float to the surface in a high-speed pod, a hero with the cure in her hands, while I rotted in the dark. But she'd forgotten one thing. In her arrogance, she'd forgotten that I knew this ship better than she did. I'd spent 10 years in the guts of these machines. I knew every bypass, every faulty valve, every shortcut. I didn't go for the airlock. I crawled toward the environmental control station. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the world fraying into gray static, but I found the manual vent for the ballast tanks. If I couldn't escape, I could at least ensure she didn't either. I grabbed the emergency wrench, my blood slicking the handle, and began to crank. The ship groaned, a deep bass thrum that vibrated through my teeth. I wasn't blowing the reactor. I was blowing the seals on the external ballast. The sub began to lurch, shifting its weight as thousands of tons of water were forced into the forward trim tanks. We weren't just sinking anymore. We were sliding off the undersea ledge and into the abyss. The glowers outside the glass began to scream, a sound that shouldn't have been possible underwater, a high-frequency vibration that shattered the plexiglass. The ocean roared in. The wall of water hit me like a freight train, slamming me back against the bulkhead. I choked, the salt burning my throat, but I kept my eyes open. In the swirling chaos of debris and drowning monsters, I saw Kavik's escape pod. It had launched, but the shifting hull of the submarine had caught the deployment rail. The pod was pinned, vibrating violently as the sub dragged it down into the trench. I saw her face through the pod's small porthole, her eyes wide with a realization that matched my own. We were going together, the betrayer and the betrayed, bound by 1,000 tons of steel and the unforgiving gravity of the deep. I found a pocket of air near the ceiling, a tiny, precarious bubble that tasted like oil and death. I gripped a handrail, watching as the glowing things swarmed the pod, their clawed fingers scraping against the reinforced glass. They didn't want the data. They didn't want the sequence. They just wanted the warmth inside. The pod's glass began to spiderweb. Kavik was screaming, a silent miming of terror behind the thick pane. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. If this was the end, if I was to be a ghost in the gears, I wouldn't be alone. The sub hit the bottom of the trench with a force that extinguished the last of the lights. The pressure was so intense now that I could feel the marrow in my bones vibrating. My lungs were burning, the air in my bubble compressed until it was a thick, poisonous mist. I closed my eyes, the sound of the ocean's weight the only thing left. But then a new sound. A mechanical hum different from the sub's death rattle. A light pure and white cut through the silt-choked water. Not the green glow of the monsters and not the dying red of the sub. A submersible, a rescue, or something else. I felt a hand grab my collar, a heavy gloved hand. I was being pulled, dragged through the water, away from the wreckage, away from the screaming shadows. I tried to fight, my limbs heavy and useless, but a mask was shoved over my face. Pure, sweet oxygen flooded my lungs, a shock so violent I vomited into the regulator. As I was hauled into the small, cramped airlock of the rescue submersible, I saw the insignia on the sleeve of my savior. It wasn't the Navy. It wasn't the government. It was a logo I'd seen on the crates in the cargo hold, the ones that had started the outbreak. "Target secured," a voice said, muffled by a helmet. "Subject shows high resistance to the strain. Proceeding to the extraction point. Leave the lieutenant, she's compromised." I looked out the small port of the submersible as we began our ascent. Below us, the Sentinels, was a jagged, glowing scar on the ocean floor. The escape pod was gone, crushed into a ball of scrap metal. And as we rose, the light of the reactor faded, replaced by the endless, encroaching black. I wasn't free. I hadn't found peace. I had just been traded from one cage to another. The monsters weren't just in the water. They were the ones holding the oxygen mask. I lay on the cold metal floor of the sub, the wound in my shoulder burning, the radiation humming in my blood. I was no longer a sailor. I was no longer a survivor. I was an asset. And as the pressure eased and we climbed toward a world I no longer recognized, I realized the true horror wasn't the long, quiet sleep in the heart of the machine. It was the fact that they wouldn't let me sleep at all. The submersible breached the surface hours later, though time had lost all meaning. The sun was a pale, sickly disk hanging in a sky choked with ash. The Atlantic, once a vast playground of blue, was a graveyard of gray swells and oily slicks. They hauled me out onto the deck of a massive, black-clad carrier, a ship that looked like it had been built for the end of the world. Men in hazmat suits moved with clinical efficiency, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. I was strapped to a gurney, my skin weeping, my mind a fractured mosaic of the horrors I'd seen. "Is he the one?" a man asked, stepping into my field of vision. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a tailored coat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the wind. He looked down at me with the detached curiosity of a boy looking at a bug in a jar. "He's the only one who survived the core exposure without turning," the soldier replied. "He's a natural anomaly, or a goddamn miracle." The man in the coat leaned closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and peppermint clashing with the salt air. "Not a miracle, Sergeant. A blueprint." He reached out and touched the blistering skin on my forehead with a gloved finger. "Welcome back to the surface, Miller. You're going to help us save what's left of this world, whether you want to or not." I tried to speak, to curse him, to tell him what happened to Kavik, but the sedative was already flowing into my veins. The world began to blur, the gray sky stretching into an infinite featureless void. My last thought, as the darkness finally claimed me for real, wasn't of the submarine or the glowing dead. It was of the ocean, the cold, uncaring Atlantic, holding the secrets I'd tried to bury. I was a ghost in the gears, but the gears were much bigger than I ever imagined. The machine was still turning, and it was hungry for more than just my life. It wanted my soul. And as the carrier's engines roared, carving a path through the ruins of civilization, I knew that the nightmare in the deep was just the beginning. The real war was only just starting, and I was the primary weapon. The hunger wasn't gone. It was just changing shape. And God help anyone who stood in my way once I woke up. The transition from the void back to reality was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent collision with the physical world. I woke up screaming, though the sound was muffled by a heavy plastic respirator strapped tightly to my face. My limbs were pinned, not by the crushing pressure of the Atlantic this time, but by thick, reinforced nylon straps that bit into my wrists and ankles. The air I breathed tasted of ozone and sterile chemicals, a sharp contrast to the recirculated, oily musk of the submarine. Above me, banks of fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic, sickening pulse, casting long, jittery shadows across a room that looked more like a butcher's shop than a medical bay. I wasn't just a patient. I was an exhibit. My skin felt wrong, too tight, buzzing with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to synchronize with the carrier's massive engines. When I looked down at my arms, I didn't see the pale, scarred flesh of a sailor. I saw veins that glowed with a faint, sickly luminescence, a ghostly emerald light that pulsed under the surface like a trapped nebula. They had done something to me while I was under. They had nurtured the sickness I brought back from the deep, turning my body into a laboratory for the end of the world. A door hissed open, and Admiral Vance stepped in, flanked by two soldiers in pressurized biohazard suits. He wasn't wearing a mask. He looked at me with the detached curiosity of a boy looking at an insect in a jar. He told me about the Vengeance, about the reactor leak that wasn't actually a leak, but a deliberate exposure to a synthesized mutagen recovered from a trench that shouldn't have existed. He explained that I was the success, the one in a million whose DNA didn't just unravel but folded into something new, something predatory. The hunger I felt wasn't for food. It was for a biological imperative I couldn't yet understand. He called me the Vanguard. He said that with my blood they could create a new breed of soldier that didn't need sleep, didn't fear the cold, and didn't die when the world fell apart. But as he spoke, I could hear the lie in his voice. He didn't want to save the world. He wanted to rule the graveyard. The hunger inside me growled not at his flesh but at his arrogance. It was a cold, calculating heat that began to melt the fog in my mind. I realized then that the submarine hadn't been a tragedy, it had been an audition, and I was the only one who passed. I waited until the Admiral got close enough to check the readout on the monitor beside my bed. The vibration in my bones intensified, a high-pitched hum that only I could hear. I didn't just feel stronger, I felt connected to the very metal of the ship. With a sudden, violent spasm that felt like my muscles were turning into steel cables, I snapped the restraints. The nylon didn't just break, it shredded. The guards reacted instantly, but they were moving in slow motion. To my eyes, the world had slowed to a crawl, every heartbeat of the men in the room sounding like a distant drum. I tore the respirator from my face and felt the raw, unfiltered air hit my lungs. It didn't burn, it tasted like fuel. I was on the guards before they could raise their rifles. I didn't use a weapon. I didn't need to. My hands moved with a precision and speed that was terrifying, striking with the force of a hydraulic press. I felt the give of their armor, the snap of bone, but I felt no remorse. The man I had been, the sailor who mourned Kavik, the man who wept for his family, was being pushed into a dark corner of my psyche, replaced by something ancient and oceanic. Vance scrambled back, his face a mask of primal terror. He reached for a sidearm, but I was already there, my hand closing around his throat. His skin felt hot, fragile, like wet parchment. I could feel the pulse in his neck, the frantic rhythm of a dying bird. I didn't kill him, not yet. I leaned in, and when I spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It was a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate from my chest. I told him that the ocean didn't like being stolen. I told him that the machine he thought he controlled was just a toy in the hands of a tide that was coming to wash everything away. Then I threw him through the reinforced glass observation window. The sound of the shattering panes was the starting gun for the nightmare. I stepped out into the corridor of the carrier, a titan of steel and hubris, and I began to hunt. The ship was a labyrinth, but I knew its layout better than the men who built it. My senses had expanded, reaching through the bulkheads, feeling the heat signatures of the thousands of souls on board. The infection within me, the glowing green fire that Vance had tried to harvest, wasn't just a disease. It was a hive mind that hadn't found its hive yet. As I moved through the lower decks, I found the others. They weren't like me. They were the failures, the shamblers that had been pulled from the sub or found in the coastal ruins and brought here for study. They were kept in pressurized tanks, gurgling in a state of suspended animation. I didn't see them as monsters. I saw them as my crew. I smashed the controls, venting the tanks, and as the green sludge spilled across the floor, the dead began to rise. They didn't attack me. They bowed their heads, their milky eyes fixed on the glowing veins in my arms. I was the ghost in the gears, and I had just given the gears a soul. The carrier, the USS Sovereign, became a slaughterhouse. The alarms were a constant wailing scream that mirrored the chaos in the narrow hallways. I led my pale, dripping army upward toward the flight deck. We moved through the engine rooms, through the galley, through the officers' quarters. The soldiers fought back with everything they had: assault rifles, flamethrowers, grenades. But the hunger was relentless. Every time one of my crew fell, two more rose from the ranks of the freshly dead. The transition was faster now, the strain evolving with every second it spent in the open air. I felt every death, every bite, every tear in the fabric of the human resistance. It was an ecstatic, horrific symphony. I found myself at the door to the bridge, the final sanctum of the old world's power. I didn't need a key. I put my palms against the heavy steel door and pushed, the metal groaning and buckling until the hinges shrieked and gave way. Inside, the bridge crew was paralyzed. They were looking at the monitors, watching their world vanish in real time. The carrier was dead in the water, the engines choked by the very biomass I had released. Admiral Vance was there, clutching a bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked at me, at the monster I had become, and he started to laugh. It was a dry, brittle sound. He told me that it didn't matter. He said the carrier had already broadcast the coordinates of the Vanguard signal. Other ships were coming. Planes were already in the air, loaded with tactical thermobaric warheads. They were going to cauterize the infection, turning the Sovereign into a funeral pyre. He thought he had won. He thought that by destroying me he could stop the tide. But he still didn't understand. The hunger wasn't just in me. It was in the water. It was in the rain that was starting to fall from the heavy gray clouds. I walked to the edge of the bridge, looking out over the flight deck. Below, the battle was over. My silent, glowing army stood amongst the wreckage of fighter jets and broken bodies, waiting for my command. I looked out at the horizon where the first flickers of incoming missiles appeared as tiny, vengeful stars. I felt a strange sense of peace. The Atlantic was out there, vast and uncaring, the place where all this began. It wasn't my enemy. It was my home. I reached out with my mind, tapping into that strange, resonant frequency that had guided me through the dark corridors of the Vengeance. I didn't try to stop the missiles. I didn't try to save the ship. I did something much worse. I signaled the deep. Far below the keel of the carrier, in the crushing depths where the light of the sun had never reached, something answered. It was a vibration that shook the very foundations of the tectonic plates, a low-frequency hum that made the ocean surface boil without heat. The water around the carrier began to churn, huge, rhythmic swells rising up as if the sea itself were breathing. I felt the presence of the things that had been waiting for the Vanguard, the true inhabitants of the abyss, the biological architects of the plague. They weren't zombies. They weren't viruses. They were the original owners of this world, and they were coming back to reclaim it. The first missile struck the bow, a blinding blossom of orange fire that shook the deck. Then another and another. The Sovereign began to tilt, the screams of the dying lost in the roar of the explosions. I didn't move. I watched the Admiral's face as the first of the deep dwellers breached the surface. They were massive, iridescent shapes that defied the laws of biology, pulling themselves onto the burning deck with limbs that looked like a fusion of bone and coral. They moved toward the shamblers, toward the soldiers, toward everything that lived and breathed, not with malice, but with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. The real war wasn't starting between men and the dead. It was starting between the surface and the deep. As the bridge began to collapse, consumed by fire and the weight of the sea, I turned my back on the Admiral. I stepped out onto the shattered glass of the observation deck and let the wind whip through my hair. The hunger inside me was finally quiet. It had been fed. I wasn't the primary weapon of the military anymore. I was the herald of the change. I looked down at my hands, the green glow now so bright it rivaled the flames of the burning carrier. I wasn't Miller the sailor. I wasn't Miller the survivor. I was the bridge between the world that was and the world that was coming. The ship gave a final, agonizing groan and began its terminal descent into the waves. I didn't fight it. I let the cold water take me. As I sank, the fire of the surface fading into a dim, flickering orange glow above, I saw them. Thousands of them, my new crew. They were rising from the dark, their bodies bioluminescent, their eyes fixed on the light I carried. We weren't ghosts in the gears anymore. We were the tide. The Atlantic embraced me, not as a victim, but as a king. The secrets I had tried to bury were now my strength. The machine of civilization had stopped turning, its gears jammed by the flesh and bone of its own arrogance. But the world wasn't ending. It was just going under. Down here in the silence of the deep, there were no generals, no carriers, no frantic radio calls for help. There was only the pulse, the rhythmic, steady heartbeat of a planet that had finally purged its fever. I felt the pressure increase, but it didn't hurt. It felt like a homecoming. I closed my eyes and let the ocean fill me, my lungs no longer needing air, my heart no longer needing blood. I was part of the darkness now, part of the infinite, featureless void I had once feared. But it wasn't a void, it was a garden. And as I drifted deeper into the heart of the new world, I knew that the hunger would never return. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was home. The nightmare was over, and the dream, the long, cold, green dream of the deep, had finally begun.